Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Luqmaan Shadrach. It's another edition of our legal series, and it's a continuing series unpacking South Africa's matrimonial property regimes. And back in studio, we'd like to welcome founder and director of Said Attorneys. He specializes in property, estate and family law. Brother Whalied Said, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you and all the viewers out there.
Jazakallah so much for affording us your time and coming
Pleasure.
in. And then also legal advisor to the United Ulama Council of South Africa, and he serves on the MJC's legal desk. Brother Ismail Mohammed, also an attorney. Assalamu alaikum to you, sir.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
It's a very important topic we're discussing, and we continue with our series that Whalied has come up with as well, and I think it's very important. And throughout today's session, we'll ask, what does true recognition of Muslim marriages look like? We've delved into this topic last week and we set the tone. And how can we ensure that the recognition aligns with both legal rights and both Islamic principles as well, particularly around matrimonial property regimes? Now, recently, the Department of Home Affairs introduced a form of recognition for Muslim marriages, but it's met with strong criticism from various ulama bodies, legal counsel as well, particularly with, from the MJC side. Their stance, I think, is rooted in the lack of alignment, basically, with Islamic principle, as well as the incomplete nature of the recognition of Muslim marriages. Brother Ismail, maybe if we can start with you, why has this been rejected so strongly?
Firstly, I think it must be made clear that the Muslim Judicial Council, the United Ulama Council of South Africa, and all the affiliated bodies around the country, their opinion is that this certificate issued by the Home Affairs is not a recognition of Muslim marriages in South Africa for all purposes.
Right.
That's now our reasoning. The reasoning is a bit complicated, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. We all know that in the apartheid years, Muslim marriages were not recognized.
Right.
Then we got the Constitution. The Constitution says everyone has equality, dignity, and freedom of religion. So we expect then that everyone must be treated equally and with the same dignity and the freedom to practice their religion. Right. Now, many courts have, we first had the Marriage Act, then we got the Customary Marriages Act, then we got the Civil Union Act. All the courts have recognized that not a single one of these pieces of legislation recognized the validity of Muslim marriages.
Right.
So that's the starting point. None of the current legislation recognized Muslim marriages. So the most significant court judgment is the judgment of the Women's Legal Center case. That judgment says no legislation, no law recognizes Muslim marriages. So this fact of non-recognition is unconstitutional. And the court said the fact that it's unconstitutional, there's an obligation on government to remedy this situation. And the court said, and this is the important part, the only way to remedy the situation is by enacting legislation. That's it. Let me repeat that. The court said, this constitutional court, the only way to remedy the unconstitutionality of the non-recognition of Muslim marriages is by enacting legislation.
So would this entail the cultural marriages in total, or just specifically Muslim marriages?
Muslim marriages.
Okay.
That court case was only about Muslim marriages. So the judgment only pertained to Muslim marriages. So this court ordered the government to come up with legislation recognizing Muslim marriages for all purposes in South Africa. From the date of the judgment until today, no legislation was enacted.
Wow.
We all know that. Everybody knows it. Otherwise, it would have been big news. Right? Now the Department of Home Affairs comes with a certificate. They say they tweaked their computers and printed out a certificate. The certificate has the word Muslim on it. Now we all know, even if a man wears a kufiya, that doesn't make him a Muslim.
Absolutely.
So even if you print out a certificate, that doesn't mean Muslim marriages are now recognized.
Right, right.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because the court said the only way to recognize Muslim marriages is by legislation, not by a tweak computer printing out a certificate.
Absolutely. And with, you know, that, and I say this with tongue in cheek, some of our departments are rife with fraught with, not following the law as it should be.
Yes,
and that's open to, for more illegal documents to be printed.
Yes. Well, actually, one of the most difficult things for our communities to understand, what I discovered in the last 2 weeks, is they don't understand that if a minister, a cabinet minister, does something, that can be against the law.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't understand that. But in our constitutional democracy, that is in fact exactly what happens. Because it's not the minister that's the law, it's the constitution that's the law.
Absolutely.
And the constitution can regulate the conduct of the minister.
I think it's valid points that you brought up as well, and something for us to consider. But if you look at the matrimonial property regimes in conflict with Islamic law, Whalied, and we've touched briefly on this last week as well, is there a critical oversight with that?
So when it comes to these, or the current perceived recognition, and I made reference to that term on the last occasion, for the reasons as that Brother Ismail just explained now. It's not actual recognition.
Yes.
So what they're in effect doing is, when you're going into Home Affairs to register your Muslim marriage, what's in fact happening is that they're simply converting your Muslim marriage to a civil marriage.
Right.
So they're not actually recognizing Islamic law, Sharia law pertaining to marriage in Islam. They're simply saying, well, we're taking your Muslim marriage and converting it either to a marriage in community of property or out of community of property. Now, there's been little to no advice or guidance or communication on that issue. They simply said, you can go and register without letting the people know and understand what the consequences of registration are. So the current problem and issue there is that if you're going to go and register without an antenuptial contract, you're actually going to end up being married by default in community of property in terms of South African civil law.
Okay.
So that's where the overlap comes in, is that marriage in community of property is not in line with the principles of Sharia.
Absolutely. And I think Brother Ismail brought up an important point, that not many people are aware of the situation right now. In hindsight, should there have been a roadshow? Should there have been a lot more information passed down through things like a Jumu'ah or a separate meeting at various points? Do you think that would have worked, Brother Ismail?
That is what is supposed to have happened. I just want to join up with what Brother Whalied said. What happens is, couple gets married in mosque. So there is an Islamic marriage. Right? The court said a Muslim marriage is a marriage solemnized in accordance with Sharia law.
Right.
That's a Muslim marriage. That's the one that takes place in mosque. When you go to Home Affairs for this new certificate, not previously, but for this new certificate, what Home Affairs does, and I got confirmation last week, Home Affairs has informed the Muslim Judicial Council that what they do is they enter you into another marriage. So you're now getting married for the second time at Home Affairs under the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act. So now you have two marriages.
Right.
You have the Muslim marriage and you have a customary marriage. But the customary marriage is in fact invalid because one of the requirements for a customary marriage is that the couple must consent to get married under customary law.
Wow.
Now, no Muslim is going to consent to get married under customary law. But there's a form that they sign. And one of the tick boxes in the form is, I consent to get married under customary law. But who reads it?
Nobody.
Nobody reads it.
Absolutely.
They just sign the form at the bottom and then they carry on. And by that, they've consented to get married under customary law.
Well, at this point, they're all in.
Actually knowing.
It's the honeymoon phase. Nobody really worries about the fine print.
So
but
now such people have two marriages. And like Brother Whalied said, there's no antenuptial contract, so they're married in community of property, even under the recognition of customary marriages.
From the legal point of view, which both gentlemen work within as well, are these serious questions that come up? Or, like Brother Ismail says, it's overlooked so easily, Whalied?
it's definitely questions that is not asked enough. And I think the problem comes back to what Brother Ismail said earlier, and that is the creation of awareness. We touched on it in the previous episode, where I also said people are too in love to want to know what's the right thing to do or take legal advice. And the problem we have is that because of the lack of awareness, people just go merrily along and almost follow the crowd, you know, because that's the in thing to do, because government said we can do that. They want to go and sign for whatever recognition so that I can put it on social media. I've got a new certificate, whatever the reason. But the serious lack of awareness as a result of not asking the right questions, and one can see that on a day-to-day basis when we consult with people and we sit and we ask the questions, they've never thought of that.
Absolutely.
Right? And I guess that is why we decided to do something like this, is in an attempt to try and create some awareness so that people can learn what questions to ask when it comes to, for example, marriage.
We're coming into wedding season, as they call it now as well, and you know, people should ask these questions, especially when you're into a second marriage. For example, you've gone through a divorce, you're going through a second marriage. There's a ripple effect of things that could happen. So we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we chat a bit more to Brother Whalied and Brother Ismail in studio about very important topics. You're welcome to email me, and we can always pose the questions in a latest episode as well, Luqmaan@Hilaal.tv. You are still watching Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on channel 347, also on our live stream, www.hilaal.tv. We continue with our legal series, and last week we had Whalied Said in studio chatting about unpacking South Africa's matrimonial property regimes. We've invited Brother Ismail Mohammed, who is a legal advisor to the United Ulama Council of South Africa. Jazakallah, gentlemen, for coming into studio and sharing such valuable information. It's topics, and often, as Whalied says, gets overlooked when couples enter into marriage. And I think as a follow-up to our first segment as well, the recognition gap between maybe divorce versus marriage. And we've had the Divorce Amendment Act of 2024 that has recently come in. It's fresh, it's new, and I'm not sure how many people are actually aware of what that means. So maybe if we can run through what that means for Muslim marriages, the Divorce Amendment Act, Whalied.
Okay, so the amendments to the Divorce Act that allows or caters for Muslim marriages makes reference to, and in layman's terms, as you said, makes reference to what can be done in respect of redistribution.
Okay.
So basically it's dealing with the patrimonial consequences of marriage, where in the past, for example, and it's applied in general terms as well to non-Muslim marriages, where if you were married, for example, by an antenuptial contract, and now there's a divorce, but there's a massive gap between the husband having enriched himself or having built up a massive estate in his name while the wife stayed at home and did the cooking and looked after the kids, and now he's left with nothing. So the amendments to the Divorce Act tries to bridge that gap, not removing the concept or the validity of an antenuptial contract, but simply looking at what was the contribution of the wife. If she had a contribution towards the portfolio that the husband was able to build up, then she should be entitled to a portion or something to that effect. Now that previously wasn't catered for in terms of Muslim marriages, even in terms of non-Muslim marriages, right? Because if you were out of community of property, you were out of community, and it was a straight, simple cut. That opens up the door, obviously, for a bit of reconsideration. It's obviously not black and white. A wife, or even a husband for that matter, will have to prove this was my contribution, this is what I've done, and this is why I should be entitled to A, B, or C. Right? So it's not a simple black and white answer. You still need to make your case to the court and still need to be able to show that I'm entitled to what I'm asking for.
Okay. Has the ulama been involved in this process, Brother Ismail? Have they contributed to a large extent to the Amendment Act?
No.
Okay.
Short answer. The long answer is the ulama have been involved with government since 1990. Trying to get government to recognize Muslim marriages and to regulate Muslim divorces in accordance with Sharia. So Muslim marriages in accordance with Sharia and Muslim divorces in accordance with Sharia.
Sharia, yeah.
In fact, anyone who has ever read the Muslim Marriages Bill will see that it caters for both marriage and divorce.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
And that's the reason why. So that bill was thrown in the waste paper basket in 2013, right? By the Home Affairs Minister at the time, who decided we don't want this kind of law. And so we have been opposed to this amendment, the divorce amendment bill. And the ulama didn't want it because basically what it does is it provides for the divorce of Muslims as other people.
Gotcha. And not according to Sharia.
And not according to Sharia. So the Divorce Act is a very old act. Comes from the 1970s.
Right.
And at that time, it applied only to marriages that took place in accordance with the Marriage Act.
Okay.
And it hasn't changed. It changed here and there, tweaked here a little bit and that.
Yeah.
But that whole act now applies to Muslims.
Okay.
Now the Women's Legal Center says, or the Women's Legal Center case, that court said that the Divorce Act will apply to Muslims. But all Muslim marriages must be treated as if out of community of property.
Okay. Okay.
But the Amendment Act doesn't say that last part. It doesn't say to be treated out of community of property. So the Amendment Act requires anti-nuptial contract, otherwise it's by default in community of property.
Very good question. So we get married in the mosque, and Imam performs and we gives us the the fatwa and also khutbah about being married, but also divorce. We shouldn't utter the words talaq, but should there a talaq take place? How does that now affect marriages that have also taken place in Home Affairs?
Well, remember the earlier scenario. You get married in mosque, you have a Muslim marriage.
Right.
You go to Home Affairs, you, without realizing, enter into a second marriage.
Right.
Either under the Marriage Act or the Recognition of Customary Marriage Act.
Right.
Most people don't know that now I have two marriages.
Right.
And that other marriage supersedes the Muslim marriage.
Wow.
So when you go to court at time of divorce, that is the marriage that will be recognized, and that is the marriage.
Despite you uttering the words.
Despite In fact, there's a whole lot of legal confusion about these things. Because the Divorce Act says that the court can terminate the marriage. Now, a Muslim marriage now falls under the Divorce Act.
Right.
Where I say a Muslim marriage, I mean a purely Muslim marriage. Not a Marriage Act or a purely Muslim marriage falls under the Divorce Act.
Wow.
But the Sharia doesn't allow a court to terminate the marriage.
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple could go through a divorce and he says, look, I've uttered the word talaq and I've given you your talaq, but still remained married in the eyes of South African law.
No, that marriage will be terminated by the word talaq.
Oh, well,
yes,
in court.
But the patrimonial consequences, the financial consequences, can still be dealt with by a court.
I get you.
Right.
Okay, I'm with you.
So those are two separate issues.
Right.
But in the case where the husband didn't say I talaq you, and the wife normally would go to the MCC for a fasakh.
Yes, yes.
In this case, she can go to court and ask the court to terminate the marriage.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Wow. So it can get complicated, and obviously, if you're not finding out all the relevant questions, asking all the current relevant questions, is this a typical scenario you would take your clients through? I mean, what are some of the obvious questions and answers to try and lessen the burden when people go through a divorce, or enter into a marriage, for that example?
I think from the onset, what we normally explain to people is that if you don't need, and this is generally the kind of advice that I would give, if you don't need civil recognition because you may be immigrating and you need a South African Home Affairs certificate, a Muslim marriage certificate is still fine because it's recognized in all the right places, not necessarily from a legal and a legislation perspective, but for example, the biggest issue normally used to come about with deceased estates.
Yes.
But the Master of the High Court has recognized Muslim marriages for probably almost a decade. They've recognized multiple spouses. And so I've always advised, if it's not needed, then you don't need to do a civil marriage.
Okay.
What I normally do advise is have a contract, right? A Muslim marriage contract to govern the terms and conditions of your Muslim marriage. And a very good example of that is I just consulted with someone in this week that had gotten married, and now they're in the process of, or they've now gotten divorced.
Okay.
But there's an issue with regards to the dowry and what's written on the marriage certificate as agreed between the parties.
Right. Right.
So now the wife says this is the dowry, the husband says that is the dowry, and there's a problem because it's not in writing.
Is this where the witnesses come in?
This is where the witness is supposed to come in, but it's an unnecessary debate.
Right.
Because if you had a contract that says the dowry is whatever, 1 Kruger Rand, whatever the case may be, then there's no dispute. No one can argue about anything.
Correct.
A standard Muslim marriage contract that we normally deal with would outline what happens in the case of divorce, what happens with the children, what happens in the case of maintenance, what happens if the parties want to divorce. Can the husband simply utter divorce, or are they bound by contractually a process of mediation before the divorce is considered? Because let's face it, we often get circumstances where the husband, out of anger, will say, I talaq you.
Yeah.
And then we get to a situation where we spoke about now, where it might be a case where the talaq was given, but there might not necessarily be witnesses. Because remember, the issue of talaq is very serious. You can't even joke about it, and it's valid, right? So if something was said, and there might have been a witness who's not available or whatever, and now you've got to fight about it. Are they divorced? Are they not divorced? What does the court do?
Right.
They don't know, and it creates problems.
Absolutely. Very quickly, in terms of our Muslim marriages, Brother Ismail, can we have a contract drawn up in, when we get married, at the mosque or in front of an imam or a maulana, and not then be taken to the courts? Can we will that marriage still be valid, and will that contract be valid between the parties and an imam?
Yes.
It can be done.
It will be. The contract will be valid between the parties.
I see.
Not
Okay.
between the imam.
Okay. All right.
Between the parties.
I see.
But the difference between that contract
Okay.
and the anti-nuptial contract is the anti-nuptial contract is also binding upon third parties, outsiders like creditors and so forth.
Right.
Whereas that contract before the imam
Yes.
won't be valid against outsiders.
Okay, I'm with you. In closing, what advice would you leave to our audience around today's topic?
Don't get married without taking advice.
I thought you were going to say don't get married in general. Yeah.
Well, there's a few people that would probably want me to say that. But I would say don't get married without taking legal advice and without a contract. Whether you're getting married in terms of South African civil law as well, still have a contract that governs your Muslim marriage.
Okay,
it's very important.
Brother Ismail?
I would like people to know that firstly, the certificate by Home Affairs does not recognize Muslim marriages. And I want people to know that Muslims in South Africa are entitled to marriage law that is akin to Sharia law, that recognizes Muslim marriages and divorces as in South Sharia law. And we must stand up and fight for it. We must stop sitting back and waiting for other people to fight on our behalf.
Brilliant. Well, great advice. Gentlemen, Jazakallah so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Shukran. Same to you.
And there we go. That's our legal hour for you. Covering a very important topic that we all need to be aware of. From all of us at the Cape Town team and myself, Luqmaan Shadrach, have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.